In 1933, a popular political party rose to power with one charismatic leader at their helm, in a country that boasted both freedom of speech and freedom of press. Now, within a matter of only a few months, all critical speech was suppressed, as they began to burn books in the streets that expressed different ideologies, and the media was censored from what they could and could not report. Now, that country was Nazi Germany, and that leader was Adolf Hitler. Now, the censorship of popular speech came at the cost of millions of Jewish lives, as they were exterminated like cockroaches. Now, you might say something like that can never happen in modern-day America. Well, I can assure you, friend, that it can and it will. And perhaps it's already happening right underneath our noses. But be sure that you don't say anything too loudly. Someone might hear you, they might become offended, and your expression of your viewpoints might be suppressed as well. Former Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was hesitant to believe that just any type of speech could be considered free speech. And he came up with what is known as the clear and present danger doctrine. And he stated, free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. Now, opponents of free speech today regularly use that quote like it's their golden rule. The founding fathers of this nation wrote the First Amendment into the Constitution because they'd come out from underneath an overbearing monarchy and suffered religious persecution over in the old world. Now, this is the very thing that they wanted to protect the citizens of the United States of America from any type of religious persecution from the government, or a government that grows too big and oversteps its bounds. Hey folks, this is Quentin with The Road Less Traveled. I'm a born-again Christian and an open-air evangelist. I've been preaching on the streets for the last 6 years, from anything like a gas station to the courthouse square to the corner downtown on the street, to large events such as Mardi Gras or the Super Bowls here in Florida. And during this last 6-year time frame, I've been questioned, and I've been detained, and I've been threatened by police officers dozens of times. Now, I don't want to give a bad rap to the police officers, but a lot of times they don't know the laws. And as law enforcement officers, they should know the laws that they're enforcing. So if anything can come about from this video today, I hope that the police can learn a thing or two about First Amendment law. And I hope that any of you street preachers, or those of you that are called to go out and evangelize the gospel, or anybody else for that matter that wants to exercise their First Amendment rights, would educate yourself a little bit first before going out about what you can and you cannot do, what freedom of speech entails. I, as a street preacher, I had to learn this right up front, and I educated myself on First Amendment rights. And these are the things that when I go out to the street, I rely upon to keep me out of jail. Now today I want to familiarize you with the First Amendment and what it entails and what it means to you. And then I want to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court and how they hear free speech cases and things that they look at and consider when they're hearing free speech cases. And finally, I want to talk to you about some of these cases that's been heard in the Supreme Court, what the verdict has been, and how that affects your freedom of speech today in the First Amendment. Now that you have an idea of what I want to discuss with you today, let's start with the First Amendment. Now, the First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibit the free exercise thereof, or to abridge the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Now notice within the First Amendment alone, the Founding Fathers protected us in 5 different areas. They protected our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom of press, freedom for the citizens to peaceably assemble, and the freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances. And particularly within the area of religion, there's kind of really 2 different things they discussed there, was that the Congress could not make any laws respecting an establishment of religion, meaning that they couldn't have a state-run church, such as what was going on with Catholicism over in England, a state-funded church. The church and state were one. So they cannot respect an establishment of religion, nor can they prohibit the free exercise thereof. And folks, that's one of the things we enjoy here in America, whether you're Christian, whether you're Catholic, whether you're Hindu, whether you're Muslim, we all have that freedom of religion, and the government cannot prohibit the free exercise thereof. Now that we've laid the foundation of the First Amendment, let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Court of the United States, or SCOTUS. Now, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land, and ultimately this is where your free speech case would be heard if you don't get a constitutional verdict handed down at the judicial level. Now, hopefully, the Supreme Court would hear your case based upon the Constitution. But there are a couple of other things they take into consideration when they're hearing these cases. The first would be, did the arrest take place in a public forum? Now, they're concerned with, was this in public or was this in private? Now, the difference, folks, is, were you on a public sidewalk? Were you in a park? Were you on the courthouse lawn? Were you on a public library property? You know, these places are funded by taxpayer dollars and they belong to us. Or were you arrested on a supermarket's property? Were you arrested on a restaurant's property, or perhaps an individual's private property that is privately owned? Were you told to leave the area where you trespassed and you refused to leave? Your refusal could hinder your case, and certainly you'll lose the case based on that alone if you're on private property. Another thing they take into consideration is, was it the right time and the right place for freedom of speech? What I mean by that, folks, is, just as I spoke about, was it in public property? We have public property in residential areas, public sidewalks that's owned by the states or whatever. But these are the things that they take into consideration. Was it in commercial district or residential? Was it the right time? Were you, for instance, in a residential area at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning with one of these loud bullhorns, giving them your worldviews and waking them from their slumber? These are certainly things they take into consideration. Also, were you inciting violence? Were you using fighting words and threatening people? Were you using obscenities such as pornographic language? These are things that can hinder your case in a free speech hearing. Now that we've discussed a few of the things that the Supreme Court takes into consideration when hearing these free speech cases, let us discuss some of the historic cases that the Supreme Court has heard and handed down verdicts upon. Now, these cases were really landmark cases, and they set a precedence for freedom of speech in the United States right alongside the First Amendment. The first case I want to discuss is Coates versus Cincinnati. Now, Mr. Coates was a student and wanted to demonstrate and protest something, and he went out to a public sidewalk with a signage and was standing on the sidewalk with a few other individuals. And at this time, Cincinnati had an ordinance in place that if you were gathered together in more than 3 or 4 individuals on a sidewalk, that could be considered obstructing the sidewalk and a hindrance to the public. So they were told to leave and refused, and they were arrested. And when it got to the Supreme Court realized that this broke the First Amendment of the Constitution, because the people have a right to peaceably assemble. And Mr. Coates was standing with the signage up alongside a building. They were to one side of the sidewalk. They were not obstructing, and they were arrested unlawfully. So the favor was handed down in their, the verdict was handed down in their favor. And what the Supreme Court had decided, or the verdict came down, was that individuals have a right to pass out literature, to hold signage, and to basically speak their mind out in public, whether the public, the police, are menaced or annoyed with their message or whatever, they don't have a right to arrest them and take them to jail. Number 2 is Cox versus Louisiana. Now this happened during the time when this nation was segregated during the Civil Rights Movement. And the Reverend Cox had come together with the Civil Rights Movement. Some students, black students, had been denied service at a local diner in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So the students, the student body came together, 2,000 students came together with several civil rights leaders. And some of the civil rights leaders were arrested before even going out. And in their place stepped up Reverend Cox. And the Reverend Cox went out with 2,000 students that day to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They had some signage, and they were also very peaceable, it's reported. And as they stood on the sidewalks, he ensured that they all stood to one side, didn't block the passageway of the sidewalks. And he gave them a speech about 20 different diners in the town that was willing to take their money as black students. And it was about lunchtime, and 19 of them would take the money, but the 20th one wouldn't. So let's go get some lunch. And at that time, there was several bystanders in Baton Rouge that moaned and groaned at what they heard Reverend Cox saying. They disagreed with the message. And at that time, Reverend Cox was arrested because the people did not agree with what he had to say. Now, when this case was heard at the Supreme Court level, it was deemed that the Reverend Cox and these 2,000 students were peaceable, and they did nothing out of the bounds of the law. He was exercising his freedom of speech. He had the right to do so. And the Supreme Court had determined that the police had arrested him unconstitutionally, that he was peaceably assembled, and he had that freedom of speech, and it cannot be abridged upon. And what they determined or handed down as a verdict was that the police, if a crowd becomes hostile, that the police must control the crowd rather than arrest the speaker. Now, this is also referred to as the heckler's veto, that the hecklers, or somebody disagrees with your message, they cannot veto your message that's being spoken. The police cannot arrest you because somebody doesn't like what's being said. Number 3, Forsyth County versus the nationalist movement. This happened in the 1980s in Forsyth County, Georgia, around Martin Luther King Jr. Day. They had a parade of festivities going on in Forsyth County, Georgia. The nationalist movement decided to show up and to express their beliefs or express their worldviews. And a group of counter-protesters came against this white nationalist movement, and the police had really begun to worry that things would erupt and there would be riots and things would get bad. The next day, the nationalist movement came downtown and wanted a permit to speak on the courthouse steps. They were told that that would cost them $100 fee for this permit. They declined and took this to the court system. Eventually it got up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled and handed down a verdict that any city or county or whatever cannot hinder somebody's freedom of speech by permits, making them pay for a permit to express their freedom of speech. And of course, this also fell under the heckler's veto, that they were fearful of what would happen because of the counter-protesters, their reaction to the message that was being spoken by the nationalist movement. And it fell under the heckler's veto as well, that police must control the listeners. If they're unruly, they must control them rather than to arrest the speakers. And that is Forsyth County versus the nationalist movement. Number 4, Saya versus New York. This case was heard by the Supreme Court in 1948. Mr. Saya was a Jehovah's Witness and went downtown to apply for a permit that he might exercise his First Amendment rights. And he received the permit and went to a public park and set up some amplification on top of his vehicle so that the patrons of the park there could hear his religious message. Now, his permit eventually ran out, and he went back downtown to reapply for another permit, at which time he was refused another permit and told that his message was annoying And the people were upset at hearing his amplification. They said his PA system was annoying. It was an annoyance to the patrons there at the park. So he took it to court, eventually went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court ruled that the local government has no right to restrict freedom of speech with permits, even in the case of amplification, that they don't have the right to require permitting for amplification. There's a lot of times that you're covering a great distance, such as Mr. Saya was there at the park, that his message couldn't be heard if he wasn't using some amplification. And also, you know, today, as an example, if we stand outside of the club district, the bars and clubs play their music, or if we go to the Pride festivals, a lot of people like to set up speakers right in front of us and blast us with loud music so we can't be heard. Folks, if our message is not heard, we're being squelched out. Kind of goes along with the heckler's veto that it doesn't matter whether the listener likes our message or not. We have that freedom of speech and we have the right to be heard. Such was the case of Mr. Saya. Number 5, Koontz versus New York. Seems that New York didn't learn. Just 2 years later, Mr. Koontz was an open-air preacher. He had applied for a permit so that he could host some camp meetings downtown, and was holding some open-air preaching messages downtown, and was granted the permit, had these camp meetings, and his permit eventually ran out. He went back to the chief of police. At that time, the ordinance said that you must get all permits approved through the chief of police. Now, when he went down and talked to the chief of police denied him another permit, said that some of the things that he had said about other religions really was uncalled for, and it wasn't right, and he wasn't going to grant him another permit. So Mr. Koontz took this to the Supreme Court. Took it to court, and eventually it got to the Supreme Court. And much the same verdict was handed down, that the local government cannot use permitting to restrict freedom of speech. In the case of Mr. Koontz, that he went back out with a permit when it was refused him, went out and preached and was arrested. So he had every right to be out expressing his First Amendment right without a permit, and the Supreme Court seen it the same way, that we can't be restricted. It's a constitutional right. It cannot be restricted by a permit that you have to pay the local government for. It's a freedom that's granted to us, a privilege. So that's the 5 different Supreme Court cases that I wanted to look at today. Today we set a foundation of the First Amendment. We built some framework with the Supreme Court of the United States and some of the things they consider when hearing these free speech cases. And then we wrapped it all up speaking about some of the Supreme Court cases that have been handed down, the verdicts, and how them landmark cases set a precedence for free speech here in the United States. Now I want you to take these things into consideration. Next time you're out and you hear someone using this, exercising their First Amendment right, and someone is offended by what they say, then perhaps you can remind them that that individual has a First Amendment right, and just as they do, to express their worldviews and their viewpoints, and perhaps not to become so offended, but just be grateful that they live in a country where we have these freedoms. Now, I like the words of British-American author Salman Rushdie. He said, "What is freedom of expression? Without the freedom to offend, it ceases to exist."
One day we will all stand before Him and give account of all that we've done. On that day He will say to the faithful, "Enter into the joy of your Lord." For the Lord delights in the death of His servants. We will see Him arise with healing in His wings, with arms open wide, and all heaven rejoicing, surrounded by His Lord.